Good evening. Welcome to Perez Art Museum, Miami. My name is Adrienne Chadwick, and I'm the Deputy Director of Education. Thank you for joining us today for our exhibition opening and art talk with artist Haroon Mirza and curator Diana Nawi. This exhibition was made possible by the Knight Foundation, John Varvatos. Thank you to Alex Logsdale and Listen Gallery, and also to Haroon Mirza Studio. Haroon Mirza, born in 1977 London, is a multimedia artist who works with audiovisual materials, electronic equipment, amplifiers, and found objects to create immersive environments and kinetic sculptures. His work amplifies the phenomenon that are often imperceptible, such as electricity. He seeks to create or distort the relationship between optics and acoustics, giving unexpected visual and sensorial analogs to what we hear. Haroon Mirza received his BA from Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton, United Kingdom, and an MA from Goldsmiths at University of London and Chelsea College of Arts in London. His work has been featured in exhibitions worldwide, including the Contemporary Art Gallery, Vancouver, Pivo, Sao Paulo, Nam June Paik Art Center, Seoul, Museum Tingley, Basel, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, Dublin, Villa Savoy, Paris, the Hepworth Wakefield, United Kingdom, and Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art in United Kingdom. Mirza is the recipient of the Calder Prize, the Nam June Paik Art Center Prize, the Zurich Art Prize, and the Silver Lion of the 54th Venice Biennale. Diana Nawi is Associate Curator at Perez Art Museum, Miami, where since 2012, she's organized such exhibitions as Adler Guerriere, Formulating a Plot, Iman Isa, Heritage Studies, and Nari Ward, Sunsplash, among others. Please join me in welcoming Haroon Mirza and Diana Nawi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I want to echo Adrienne's thanks to Listen Gallery, to John Varvatos, as well as to the Knight Foundation, and thank everyone on PAM's staff, including the education team who organized this, and our amazing exhibitions team, Jay Ore, Ed O, Emily Vera, who really made this exhibition, which we'll spend the next bit talking about. It's a quite technically sophisticated project, and I was really, it was great. The team really came together and realized this work. So we're gonna have a kind of free-form conversation and look at a couple of previous examples of work that resonate with this project, as well as get into some of the technical and conceptual details of this new piece, which hopefully a lot of you have had the chance to see upstairs on the second floor in our double height project gallery, and if not, hopefully after the talk you'll be able to go see it. So can we begin by asking you to describe the project?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess could be a long description, but like a
short one,
like a short description. So
the elevator.
I mean, in short, it's a space that's acoustically controlled in some way. So it's kind of has a very specific acoustic, which is by design. And it also has this 8-channel sound and light piece, I guess, which is in a circle. So it's kind of surround sound in many ways, and it's quite, after completing it, because one never really knows how it's going to turn out until it's done with projects like this, new works like this. It feels kind of quite experiential and ritualistic in some ways, and kind of almost like a place of sanctuary more than, because I actually thought it'd be opposite. I thought it might end up being quite aggressive and quite a difficult space, but it's not. It's quite tranquil and has a calming sort of effect very experiential. And I think I've got some ideas of why that might be, but we can talk about that later.
And it's interesting because you kind of made the same, not mistake, but you said it's sound, and then you said sound and light. And so I think one of the things that's really important about your practice is that you're often identified as a quote unquote sound artist, and there's a very particular history of art around sound and quite particular theorizations around that field. But in many ways, we talked about your work as kind of bridging this space of installation or experience and dealing with all of these kind of sensory perceptions. And so I think this piece is quite interesting because it is, I think, notable, of course, for its sound, but seeing or hearing the piece is this kind of multi-sensory experience.
Yeah, sure. I mean, always have trouble with the term sound art because it's relatively new, kind of since the 60s, really, with people like John Cage, Max Neuhaus, and others, Stockhausen maybe, so there's this kind of people that worked their way from chamber music or, music or avant-garde music into the realms of the visual. And kind of what I'm doing is like the other way around, but the term sound art is strange because we kind of always had sound art, but we just used to call it music. Right. And we still call it music, but there's this kind of like thing, I guess it's to do with social structures and class systems maybe that, art's kind of more highbrow, it's elevated to a different kind of status, and for better or for worse, it's kind of it's a strange thing. I mean, for me, it's for worse in a way because it alienates the way people engage with art. But sound art's always existed. It's just material that's organized in space and time, which is the same as art, composition. But it was just called music for most part of,
But you always largely you show in the context of art.
Yeah.
Museums.
Yeah, and then I guess what you were asking before, the experience is multisensory. The experience that with a piece like this is very physical. So there's things that you might not even notice that you're experiencing. Your body is experiencing, smell for a start. The smell of the carpet and the foam is very particular. So you've got, that sense is being stimulated in a different way to the rest of the museum. The sound itself is so physical because of the frequencies that you can actually feel it on your body. It's not just your eardrum that's vibrating and that's being processed as sound, but it's also, you can feel it in your gut and other parts of your body. Then there's other acoustic things that are going on that you wouldn't perhaps know or definitely not see, which is the height above. All the sound is going up there and reverberating and coming down, and you're perceiving that as reverb, because that sound is very dry. It's a very clean sound, but it doesn't feel like that in the space because of that height, which is a very particular thing. So it's not at all just about sound for me, or for anyone that encounters the work, I don't think. And it's sort of multi-sensory, so it's about experience,
Can you talk about a little bit approaching, so this project, so Pam has this double height, which is 30 feet tall. The majority of Pam's galleries on this floor, I think, are 16 feet. And so this is literally double that and quite small compared, it's much more vertical than it is horizontal gallery. So you have this quite upward sweep and, a single door and a single clerestory window up at the top. It's a relatively simple, all concrete space. And I had the pleasure of kind of picking an art, being assigned to work in this space and picking an artist who would approach it. And Pam, if you've been here, has done like a wall drawing, it's done sculpture, it's done immersive sculptural installation, and most recently a kind of walk-in, kind of really built out amazing video space with this huge sculptural intervention. And so what I felt like we hadn't done in that space was think about like transforming the entire space into a singular experiential place. And I know your work from the internet, but also in real life from having seen this piece that maybe we can talk about in a bit. But I wonder if you can talk about, when I approached you to think about this space, kind of how you went about conceptualizing how you might use that space and how you go about kind of thinking of a new project, given, I mean, you're always quite site-specific, even if it's not quite as responsive to a particular set of conditions, or?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I'd been in a lot of spaces like that before, recently actually. There's a fair few museums that have just been built recently that have this kind of cube with a really tall ceiling. And one of the things that you probably know more than I do about this particular space is the acoustics. Because when I arrived, there was already carpet and foam. So I didn't hear the acoustics before, you know, because this is one of the first times in a while that I didn't actually do a site visit, partly for practical reasons, but also because I kind of already understood the type of space it was. There's a very similar space actually being built in Paris right now, also by Rem Koolhaas, that I'm working with, and there's a similar kind of thing going on there. But I guess the point that I was making, that the acoustic, the thing that I wanted to change was the acoustics in the space quite radically, which I think happens just from the application of the foam and the carpet. Anyway, how was it? I mean, did you notice a difference?
Yeah, so the gallery has a layer at about waist to above your head, or like knee to head, of this kind of pseudo-acoustic foam that has been built out, something that you might recognize from a recording studio, this kind of conical.
Some images up here as well.
Yeah, which this is the background of that, and there's these kinds of, there's this sense. I mean, this is what we talk about when we talk about the sensory aspect of sound and sight, which I think your practice is so tied to, is that when you came into the space after the foam and carpet were up, there was a density to the space and to the sound that I think happened in that space. And if you lay on the carpet, it's quite different. You feel the openness, you feel a sort of almost breeze of sound or something, a kind of bouncing around.
Yeah, because you still have concrete underneath, and you get the the sound bouncing horizontally at that low level. Then you also get standing waves where they sort of cancel each other out. So just by going down, you have a very different acoustic experience than you do standing up. So I guess the piece is it kind of invites you to sit down. Firstly because there's a carpet and the speakers at a low level, so there's this kind of a
Gravity.
Yeah. There's a kind of sense of gravity, and then it changes again. Acoustically, and all these things that we're talking about are quite subtle things, but I think the human body is quite sophisticated in understanding these things, even if you're not consciously thinking about it. So it's kind of an interesting process, just occupying a space like that and observing how you might behave. It's quite meditative.
And is that how you often begin projects? Is it in response to architecture or space?
Yeah, one of the reasons. It's always like sight, and then the context of that site, and then the wider context. And there's like layers of context. So it began with the space itself, then the context of the museum, and then looking at the collection, being inspired by these Chopin typewriter pieces from the Concrete Poetry collection, and then it kind of slowed down there. It didn't go into sort of anything specific about Miami, but it kind
does
of
relate to the museum's collection. So maybe we can talk a bit about that. So PAM is home to an amazing collection of concrete poetry from the Sackners, who many of you know, who are an amazing collecting couple in Miami, who Pam acquired, I think, a small but wonderful portion of their really epic collection. And part of it is these typewriter-based art, which is a subfield of concrete poetry. And in November, Pam will have an exhibition of that specific type of concrete poetry. But what it is the use of literal typewriters and text to create formal patterns that are visual in their, that's kind of what draws them into being, but there's a certain obvious textual and implicit sonic quality to these poems. And so we had kind of gone through the collection to talk about them a bit and how they functioned.
Yeah, and another thing to mention is probably that this work also comes from another piece which was based on drawings by Channa Horowitz. So there's a correlation between Horowitz and her works. There might be some in this slide sequence that I can pause, ask for it to be paused on when it gets to there. And she kind of worked on graph paper that was divisible by 8 and filled in colors, little squares of colors, and made various types of composition from these colors. And it's quite a systematic and kind of it's a systematic way of working. And I think the Concrete Poets also adopted this methodology somehow, and it's got this approach which is akin to programming and computer language and code and these things. And it talks about language at a very abstract level and what language and communication is in many ways. Let me see if it can get to that point. But so then, thinking about that piece, there is also a video. Here's one now. This
Pause there, Dan.
Yeah, I think the next one. Let's pause on this one. So, or either one is fine. So she has this kind of system. I don't know if anyone's familiar with her work. She's like a West Coast artist from LA and died maybe 4 years ago. And made this whole body of work called the Sonokinetography series. This is a specific series of works. And her intention, in a way, was that they could be read as scores, either musical scores or scores to dance or scores to spoken word, but they're open for interpretation. So a couple of years ago, I just sort of came across her work, first encountered it in the Venice Biennale maybe 6 years ago, I can't remember exactly when. And when I saw the work, I immediately saw a kind of a relationship to what I was doing, because I was working with 8 channels of sound or electricity, let's say, which was manifest in both light and sound, which is what this piece also is. And immediately saw this was a way for me to not compose and just be the kind of facilitator of composition. So these became the composition, and I was just becoming like a facilitator for this composition. And that ended up quite an interesting proposal in the end, or project, because it was very collaborative with someone that had already passed away, but the relationship that I ultimately forged with her daughter was quite an interesting and fascinating one. And then taking that systematic approach and thinking, well, actually, this is a way of this like becoming the facilitator is kind of an interesting way of thinking about this, rather than composing. And what happened here was looking at the collection, and I mean, some directions that went in was quite interesting, and others, not so interesting. But then when I fell on the concrete poetry, for instance, it was a weird thing, because it was just an inspiration, but and I kind of knew that I had to somehow translate these, but it wasn't going to be an exact transcript. It was never going to be an exact transcription with the system that I'd created, and in the end, generated this sequence that we can maybe switch to.
Can you be more explicit in describing the 8 channels? Like, so you assign a color.
Yeah, maybe if we play the video, maybe this is a good moment to play the video. So here's a sequence of the piece that was made in relation to the Horowitz drawings. mean, it's actually quite hard to capture on video, so you're better off seeing the piece upstairs. But what you've got happening here is there's electrical signal being sent to 8 speakers, and that signal is being seen as lights. So 12 volts of electricity is driving the LEDs, and they make the colors from the Horowitz drawings. But the electricity is also going directly into the speakers, so you hear the electricity live in real time. So you're simultaneously hearing and seeing the electricity, which is generating the colors of this score. So it kind of made this. So it was basically a system to read and present her drawings, and any of her drawings from the sonokinetography series could be transcribed into this system.
It's quite interesting because for me, this is the piece that I've seen in real time, and it feels like such a perfect resonant practice with your practice. Like it, because so much of your work is a kind of synesthetic, which is like a confusion of senses around seeing what we hear or not seeing what we hear. And often when all of our perceptions are functioning in a normal way, then we see what we hear. Like I can hear the echo of the microphone, and that is clear coming from the speakers, and all these things kind of line up, where sound comes from, what sound, its invisible kind of structures, and how shape orders it. But I think a lot of your project largely has to do with sort of like fine-tuning that in such a way as to disrupt it or to transform or amplify that relationship. And that feels like so much about what her practice kind of started to allude to without ever manifesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just the term sonokinetography suggests sound, kinetic, and graphic.
Right.
So it's got these. So she was very open to all these forms of perception. But I guess, we mustn't forget that sound and light are 2 different types of waves. You've got the electromagnetic spectrum, which is what light is part of. But then sound waves are different in that they're physical things. It's the molecules of air actually moving and hitting your eardrum and vibrating, and you're processing that, And both these things happen in parts of the brain that are not connected to it either, So your visual cortex is not actually connected to your eyes. There's no light that goes to your visual cortex. It's completely...
Can you pause it here, Dan?
It's completely dark, and so the image that you're forging in your brain is just electrical signal in the end, and the same with your ears. So it's, so you're getting, from here, you're getting electrical signal turning into these forms, and then going back into your brain doing or your senses, stimulating the eyes with light, with electromagnetism, and stimulating your ears with vibration. Then it becomes electrical signal again, and then your brain processes it. So it's kind of a funny thing that's going on. So this is the score for this piece.
So the name of the project is Acid Guest, which is ACIDGEST. And this is a phrasing of your own invention that sort of references acid test and guest, and it has this kind of playful, kind of coming out of sort of seeming a history of concrete poetry and Dadaist, and kind of, that has this resonance with our real life, but has a kind of arbitrariness as well. And then do you want to talk about how you arrived at your own score?
Yeah, so the term itself comes from, as you said, this sort of, the term acid, it's a play on the words acid test, which is these parties that people were having in the 60s during sort of the end of the counterculture movement, I guess, where people would take acid and see what it does, when it was still legal, I think, at that point. And I was interested in these. I was just I'm kind of interested in this subject at the moment, psychedelics and entheogens and this plant medicines and these things and the history around that, and then its relationship to the counterculture movement, and also Silicon Valley and computing, and so that sort of comes out from there as well. So that and then there's also this relationship between all those things and DNA. So this.
You want to
the-
say more about that?
Sorry.
Do you want to?
Yeah, what the relationship between? Right. I mean, that's kind of a big. There's a really good book called *The Cosmic Serpent* by someone called Jeremy Narby. That's quite an interesting subject about DNA and shamanism, I guess. And he talks about plant intelligence, really, and the fact that we share DNA with all other living, entities and anything that has life has DNA, and we share the majority of our DNA, up to 50% with most things. There's also kind of these other things. I mean, it's kind of. I mean, I could talk forever about just the relationship between psychedelia and DNA. But I guess Jeremy Narby's book talks about in indigenous cultures around the world, the serpent is a very iconic thing that appears, and the idea that the serpent came from space, but the serpent, he argues, is a representation of DNA, and the two serpents together, and the relationship between medicine and serpent is quite interesting. I mean, even I think it's in the United States where on ambulances you have the symbol, twin snakes, may come from this symbolic sort of, or symbolize DNA in some form. So there's an interest there, and then with this, I needed to get rid of one of the T's in the phrase acid test, because for the system to work, I can have the same letter twice. And then it occurred to me that if I swap one of the T's for a G, then we have the kind of the chemicals that are found in the letters for the chemicals that are found in DNA, A, G, C, T. So there's this kind of reference to DNA here, and then some of the way that we see the score, it's got these sort of spiraling sort of forms that somewhat resemble DNA sequences. And but to get the score in the end, I again wanted to remove any compositional aspect from myself from this process. So we wrote, in the studio, we wrote an algorithm that basically takes that phrase acid guest and spits out all the possible combinations of that phrase.
So each letter in this phrase is assigned a color, right?
Yeah. So each letter in the phrase is assigned a color, just literally systematically RGB, so red, green, and blue, primary colors of light. Cyan, magenta, what's the other one? Yellow.
Yellow.
Sorry. And black, which is off, so that's like no electricity, and white, which is all of the colors mixed. So they were 8 colors. And then the algorithm just, it's like almost like a code-breaking algorithm that just went through all the possibilities. And in the end, it was something like 16.5 million combinations. So that became the score. Yes, the 16.5 million combinations of the phrase acid guest. So then the system upstairs, this piece, this thing, just literally just plays all those sequentially.
So for instance, like it would be each letter in a line represents a speaker, and so if it's a black T, that's off, and so it would beat for 1, 2, 3, 4 off pulses, and then the one across is white, and the one across is red, and the one is yellow, and each one is programmed for what, a quarter second? How long?
It's a microsecond. It's a thousandth of a second.
A thousandth of a second, and so to play this 16.5 million line composition, it's, what did we calculate? 18 days.
Yeah, 18 days. So it will. Yeah. So if we turn it on, it will run for 18 days before it loops again.
Before it repeats itself. And I think what is interesting about working in this mode, it's quite, again, it comes back to this idea, it's quite systematic. Like it's a very logical, I mean, it's literally a computer programmer, establishes these 16 million lines, but it's this total Dadaist chance thing where you feed in a certain idea into a machine and then it comes out with something.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of alluded to this at the beginning, but it's, I think for a curator, for an artist, working on new commissions like this, you're just exchanging emails and having Skype calls and looking at samples of materials online until such a time as everything gets together in the same space and you hook everything up. I mean, there's a certain things you could test for, but it all has to be together so there's a certain kind of chance aspect around everything, I think.
Yeah, right. I mean, I had no idea what it will be like, so until the very end. I mean, some things happen very late in the day, like on the way here, I decided to set the frequencies because the frequency of each color of light, so red, green, and blue has a frequency. I decided to set them based on some of the Fibonacci sequence. And the frequencies are sort of around the same frequencies as a human voice as well. So there's this element, and that happened quite late in the day, but then I think it makes a huge difference. But so there was some decision-making process, but there is like this systematic thing, and it all comes together in the space at the end, and then you just have to accept what it does to a degree.
And I think we were both, we had talked about, there's a large glass door and there's a few interventions into the actual architecture, partly to think about controlling sound. Sound is it wants to leak everywhere and a quite radical agent to kind of introduce into a museum. And so we talked a lot about that, but I think the piece is there's something quite soothing about it. It's 8 speakers where if you go into the middle of this circle, it's quite an intense force of energy and force of sound coming towards you. But I think this question around how the ultimate effect of the piece is quite interesting.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate that soothing quality. And like I said earlier, we can talk about this now, is that the reason maybe, I think, I don't know, is that because of the frequencies of the sound, because it's around the same frequency, like the human voices are between, I think it's 85 and 200, depending on whether you're male or female, hertz. And and this is, I think it starts at, I can't remember what I said it at, but I think it's 36. But it's Fibonacci sequence numbers.
How does that can you unpack the Fibonacci?
Oh yeah, that's basically, it's a mathematical equation, or a mathematical phenomenon, let's say, that someone discovered, that if you add up, if you start with a number 1, and then you have another 1, so you need 2 numbers at least, then you add those 2 numbers together, you get a 2. Then you add the first number to the last number. So this Fibonacci sequence starts at 1, then it's 1 again, then it's 2. And then the next one is 2 plus 1, 3. Then 3 plus 2, 5, and so on and so forth. And this sequence is found in nature everywhere. So it's in the human body. It's to do with spirals in sunflowers, and so in shells everywhere. So it's associated with fractal geometry, and it's a very sort of natural mathematical phenomenon, and nobody really knows why and what its purpose and function is, but it has some resonance to life for some reason. So yeah, those numbers and the fact that it's human voice frequencies, I think, gives it something very special in the relationship to us and the way it's perceived. So I think that soothing and comforting and therapeutic thing that we've experienced might have. So, I'm speculating here. It might have something to do with that.
Well, and I think all of it's sort of one of the things I noticed when I saw the Shauna Horowitz pieces. It's a little bit like when you're at a rock concert and it's so loud and you're transported. You kind of have these kind of like extra sensorial, like extra corporeal experiences when you're in a place that is dominated by sound instead of sight or something. And so I think it was like this transcendent quality starts to happen here, because your body becomes swept up in some other tempo that's established by the piece, because what you're seeing and how it's sounding is sort of carrying you along. And you have no real fixed point outside of that within the space.
Yeah, right. And it goes back to psychedelia, but it's more specific than psychedelia because it's actually shamanism and altered states of consciousness, which has been happening arguably since the birth of consciousness, or it could even be the thing that created consciousness around 50,000 years ago, when we see cave paintings in places like Pekmel or the South African, the Sand People rock art and cave paintings. And those are depictions now that it's acknowledged scientifically that those are depictions of altered states of consciousness. And it's unclear how they were achieving these, perhaps through plants of certain types, but also they know that stress to the body, or just being in a dark space for a certain period of time, or dance and music and repetitive drum beats and types of sound can also lull you into these altered states. And then with these states you have all kinds of things which start from entoptic phenomenon, which is patterns and visual distortions, to full-blown kind of hallucinations. You know, you meet entities and other worldly things. And it's been, and this is something that humanity's engaged with since, like I was saying, the perhaps the birth of being self-aware and consciousness, and the culture, when language and alchemy, which led to science, all these things, religion, this, what do we do with the dead, sort of emerged. Because 150 years prior to that, humans didn't do much. They were like other mammals. We just had like rudimentary tools, I think we might have had fire, which is quite an achievement, but for 150 years, not much happened. And then suddenly overnight, 50,000 years ago, there's art and culture and
Industry and
yeah.
major developments.
Yeah, some developments, yeah.
Can you
Skyscrapers.
talk a little bit about how you started to work this way? I mean, you studied painting at some point?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Really
you
bad
had like
painter.
a normal art school painting. I mean, so can you talk about how you landed on kind of working in these kinds of, with technology, with sound, with sight, with music?
I was always interested in sound and music, I guess. Yeah, I was interested in music, and kind of just into music. I love music. And at some point, at art school, when I was studying painting, I think I got interested in the acoustic space and the pragmatics of acoustic space. I started reading McLuhan and his essays on acoustic space that are really fascinating. I highly recommend them. His argument is more about media and how media is acoustic, but anyway, his sort of insights into just the pragmatics of auditory space are interesting. And then I started, I guess, making representations of these things that I was learning, and it was still pretty bad. Bad things that I was making.
Paintings.
Yeah, the bad paintings, and then sculptures, and pretty bad sculptures. It wasn't until I started studying design when I got interested in autonomous systems and designing alternatives to systems that provide alternative ways to engage with music, either listening to music or making music. And I ended up just messing around and making these kind of weird autonomous systems that were sort of self-governing in some way. And that's really where this came from, and then that sort of grew. And it was neither sculpture or music or anything particular, but it just ended up being something in between these things. And then elements of design and architecture and other fields of production sort of entered, and engineering and all these things. Which, by the way, I have no training in music or electrical engineering or programming or any of these
Or
things.
architecture or any of the, yeah.
Yeah, so I only have really studied art and design. And that's how it sort of evolved.
Can you keep running the slideshow, Dan? Because there's also, I think, one of the things in your practices, there's a very precise vocabulary that you work with. You've seen it here. There's like LED lights. There's this recycled foam that you use in this kind of like this is a great example of the kind of material vocabularies that are at play. Can you talk about kind of establishing that vocabulary and then how you kind of use it and redeploy it and remix it for various projects, or how you kind of landed there?
Yeah, I guess the LED sort of appeared when I was studying at Goldsmith. I was doing this design masters, and it was it's when I first discovered that you can hear a sound and see a light simultaneously, and that became the main principle. And then the rest, I guess,
Because
the other.
you noticed that you heard sound and
Yeah, it was kind of, I just, I was hooked on this idea that you could see the sound, and so that was kind of a sort of first, that's like starting that vocabulary with the LEDs, and then that kind of came into where it is now, using these sort of strips of LED tape. And then the foam was really to do with acoustics and controlling acoustics and thinking about how acoustic space happens. When I was on my undergraduate, actually, when I was studying painting, I used to go to the University of Southampton campus to be a guinea pig sometimes in the anechoic chamber they have there at the Institute of Sound and Reverberation.
it's like a sensory deprivation.
Yeah, well, it's to do with acoustic research. They do like all kinds of research in there, from military stuff to just sound design, like sound system design and things. So for exchange, for spending time in there for exchange, I'd be a guinea pig for their experiments, and they'd like play these weird things to me. And anyway, won't go into that. So I always had this architecture of the anechoic chamber, from that early experience, and then when it came to kind of thinking about space and controlling sound, I immediately just reverted to this sort of I don't know what you'd call it, this method of controlling sound. I mean, the peaks and troughs of these triangle wedges is the most effective way to absorb
Sound,
sound and stop it reverberating. So it's not. So anechoic and soundproof are two very different things. Sometimes people get confused.
Soundproof is to like not leak out, and anechoic is like keep it from bouncing.
Yeah. So I mean, this room is quite anechoic because it doesn't echo much because of the curtains, but it's not soundproof because we can hear.
I can hear the.
we can hear the
like
party
outside,
going down there. So that becomes an aesthetic as well, but that becomes part of the visual language. And all these things are somehow just practical solutions. They're like, they're kind of
Right.
And I don't know what the actual thing is that's the work, but everything ends up being some kind of like practical.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this, that there's nothing decorative in the work. Like, practical elements are aestheticized.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's nothing decorative.
There's nothing decorative, but they are sometimes, they can, if you look at, I mean, like those walls are beautiful, to me, I don't know.
No, they're beautiful. Yeah.
I don't know to anyone else. But
Yeah. And one of the things we talked about a little bit, I mean, we had this long conversation yesterday about this, but I think one of the challenges of museums is that they're a space for conversation. And so a lot of, for instance, my job is to think about how we might narrate or give language to art, which sort of at its core tries to deny, right? If somebody wanted to linguistically express something, they would write an essay.
Yeah.
But instead they've painted a picture or made a sculpture, et cetera. And so that in some ways your piece, like we just had this thing upstairs where somebody said, well, I don't understand it. And then you said, well, it's a feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, it's a feeling, not something to learn. I mean, it's a language, but that language isn't like spoken word where it's not semantic. And music, who is it? Pierre Schaeffer? I can't remember who talks about modes of listening. Semantic listening, causal listening, and reduced listening. So causal listening is like when you're hearing a sound and you're trying to work out what's making that sound, it's like, that's a stereo, I think.
Yeah.
And then there's semantic listening, where you're trying to get meaning out of the sound. So when you're speaking, that's a form of semantic, or when you're listening to someone speak, right now you're doing semantic listening because you're deriving meaning from these sounds, my words. And then there's reduced listening or acousmatic listening, which is about just the experience of sound and perceiving
What is it
sound and
called?
just enjoying. Pardon? Acousmatic or reduced listening.
Reduce listening.
There's two names for it, I don't know why. And that's the interesting one. And I think a form of communication happens there, which is kind of way above the level of semantic communication. And I think maybe this is something that, I don't know, humans as a race are evolving towards. Like we talked about octopus this morning or yesterday.
Octopus
right?
this morning, yes.
So the idea that octopus have been around, or kettlefish have been around for, no, cuttlefish, cuttlefish, yeah, right, have been around for, what's a kettlefish? I don't even know. Been around for millions of years, longer than us, so they've evolved for way longer than us, and they have this really sophisticated way of communicating through color and movement, which is perhaps way more advanced than human beings.
But if you think about this idea of like deriving meaning, or this idea of driving sensorial like expression on some level, then how do you sync that with your interest in sort of like leaving? I mean, there was a lot about the piece that you didn't know until it began, like what the effect of the piece would sort of be. If we talk about it like on a communicative level,
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, right. So I guess your question is why I'm saying things without knowing what I'm saying.
Well, right, or you're sort of flipping the switch to allow something to be in the universe. I mean, it's a non-value judgment question, but it's just a question around, like for you, what is the interest in? I mean, there's a very experimental dimension to your practice, right? There's a certain set of things that come together, but the end result remains to be seen until it's actually realized.
Yeah.
But I think that other question of where the interest lies for you and in what it might do for an audience.
Well, I think it's what you said. It's an experiment. So every experiment has a result, and it may not be the result you're looking for, but it's a result nonetheless. And actually, there's something that a friend of mine who's a scientist was talking about, is that in science, it's a very kind of a strange thing where the sort of convention now is to do these experiments to get specific results. But if you don't get those results, somehow that it's a failed experiment. But actually, it might be more interesting what the results are saying, you know. Right. So it's kind of, I mean, that's the point of experimentation, that you do something and you see what what happens, and that's my interest. It's like what am I going to learn? What's going to come out of this? What am I going to learn? And then if I learn something, perhaps other people might learn something, or you'll see that process as of value, some value in that process. Yeah.
So what have you learned from this piece?
I guess those things that we were talking about earlier, that there's that sense of calmness and it's something which is so alien somehow, like layers of computer program and 16 million
and
lines of text and all this systematic, just like
non-human
things somehow are somehow actually have an emotional response. So I've definitely, I don't exactly know what it is I've learned, but I feel like I have.
It's quite remarkable that there's some bodily resonance with the whole piece.
Yeah.
Which is all mechanics.
Yeah, it wasn't what I was expecting at all. I was expecting something a bit more aggressive and machine-like, and I mean it still is, but there's something else to it.
Right, the frequencies, I mean they're literally sound, I mean they're mechanical sound.
Yeah, it's on and off, it's electricity turning on and off at various rates.
Intervals, yeah. I think we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I know there were some technical questions I was getting earlier in the day that I was ill-equipped to answer, and Haroon is here if you'd care to ask him. And anything else if you've had a chance to see the piece.
Can you hear me okay? So Are you familiar with MRI machines and how?
Yeah, yeah.
So your work is imaging sound. So MRIs are imaging electrons moving, and I just would like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about MRI machines, but I'm going to go in one soon for this.
Well, then you should have fun, I think.
Pardon?
You should have fun. It would be an experience. Maybe some
Yeah,
art
I
will
mean,
come
it's
out of
for,
it.
I'm helping a neuroscientist friend of mine, another guinea pig thing. He's going to give me a dose of DMT. You know what that is? Dimethyltryptamine. It's a very powerful psychedelic. It's the most powerful psychedelic known to, but it's endogenous, so it exists in the human body somewhere. But it's the thing that's probably, well, they think it might be the cause. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent here, but it might be responsible for near-death experience and shamanic experience, religious experience,
Like
mystical.
when people have like a vision, right?
Yeah, visions and things, yeah. Religious, mystical experience. What happens when you meditate? What happens when you do yoga for extreme? Anyway, so I'm going to be a guinea pig in a MRI machine. So they're going to do fMRI. And yeah, there's a piece that what's his name? Sorry, James Turrell made. Which is apparently quite like a MRI machine where you kind of go back into this thing and there's a light display.
Well, it's just the integration of sound within an image.
Yeah.
And there's an experience that most people wouldn't consider a medical procedure art, but there's something artistic about it. So
Yeah, sure.
when you do it, although you'll be in an altered state of consciousness, it sounds like, that it would be interesting to see or hear what your impressions were.
Yeah, no, I'll report back.
Largely it'll be.
Yeah, right. I don't
I'll
remember
look for
anything about the
future
machine. I was saying earlier that there's a friend of mine that's a movie director, and he's making a film that's set in the future, and not too distant future, where iPhones have gone smaller and smaller, and they're just little chips in your brain. But technology has a way of like sorting out all your illnesses and ailments. But there's another sort of ailment that's emerged, which is digital fatigue. So fatigue from these digital things that are inside of you. And he wants to shoot a scene where somebody goes into hospital or to some place for therapy, and the therapy is light and sound. So I'm working with him to, design the set for this scene. But it's an interesting thing. There's an interesting sort of parallel there, because it's science fiction, but somehow the fictional element is getting less and less the more we kind of discuss it, which is quite interesting. Anyone else?
Hi. I have two questions. One is kind of in your value system. It seems like your greatest value in your work is experientialism. Do you think that translates into your personal life, and how does it translate into your personal life? And secondly, I just like to understand like who I'm listening to a little bit more. Like what do you do in your spare time? What kind of things do you like to learn about?
I'll answer the second question first, because I think I've already forgotten the first question. Value systems, right. In my spare time, I don't get much spare time. I have 2 young children, so they occupy most of my spare time, and that's very experiential, so it's connected to the first question. So that's, but otherwise, I read and, watch a lot of YouTube videos well, at the moment, I watch a lot of lectures from this is sounding so geeky, lectures from the Royal Institute it's the scientific, is it called the Royal Institute? Yeah, the Royal Institution, yeah. Lectures, scientific lectures. I'm doing a residency at CERN soon, So I'm kind of preparing for that because I know nothing about physics or quantum mechanics. So, but I find it quite pleasurable because it's quite entertaining. And then, what else do I do in my spare time? Do I want to play sports? Not much. No. Do some exercise, but it's just kids, kids, and yeah. Yeah. Oh, right. That. Right. No, I don't. I've drunk ayahuasca once. I've consumed mushrooms a few times. I used to do acid when I was a teenager. I did it like 2 or 3 times. But I'm not like, so I don't do any of this stuff. Now when I do it, it's more like to understand it, more sort of, intellectually is not the right word because that all goes out the window. I don't know if anyone has had this experience, but that sort of disappears with anything shamanic. But yeah, I like to learn about those things and kind of look into it and talk to shamans more than be sort of under their spell, so to speak. Yeah. But it is all related to experience, like it's. Yeah, it's kind of linked. I think, what the interesting thing that I think is, it comes from people like Terence McKenna, is that shamanism, well, in the West, art is actually a diluted form of shamanism, a contemporary diluted form of shamanism, because it's engaging with this otherness that, and then trying to translate that into this realm, and that's kind of what artists do, I think.
Do you see yourself in that role? I mean, do you think about that?
I think about it, but I don't see myself as a shaman. No. I mean, the term shamanic, shaman's an interesting term because it isn't of a specific...
Religious.
Yeah, and it's, and it's kind of a global phenomenon, and it's just the term that's assigned to all these different types of cultures practicing the same kind of things. I think the term's actually Siberian, it comes from Siberian shamanic practice, but it's applied to all types of, medicine men and witch doctors and, yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just, sorry about that. I guess, I really like this sort of paradox. For me, it's paradoxical anyway, and very appealing. The way you use Fibonacci, scientific systems, and so forth, and a lot of sort of intellectual thought, and then you sort of let go of the results, which is, I guess, maybe a little bit shamanic. And then you talk about, psychedelic experience. Do you see what I mean? They seem to be sort of polar worldviews. There's this classical kind of, the universe is a structured place, and we can develop Pythagorean systems and electronic systems and stuff like that, and you seem really fascinated by that. At the same time, it's sort of like you're also fascinated by, hey, whatever happens, happens, Yeah. And that's very appealing to me. But what I guess I'm wondering is, do you kind of lean one way or the other? Do you seem to see the universe as a more structured place? Or I guess you're trying to integrate the two. So maybe you could just talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, right. There's a crisis in science for sure. This reductionist, materialist sort of endeavor in science is kind of falling apart a little bit. Like, for instance, at CERN, there's a massive crisis. They spotted the Higgs boson, and it just kind of went, all right, now what, but they find millions of other particles at the same time that they can categorize or not, and this idea of, it is, it's related to your question as well. There is, it's at odds to this sort of, science and shamanism are at odds to each other, but I think there's a massive connection between, because it's the question of consciousness. If you think about experience as consciousness, that's the problem with science, that you can't experiment with experience. You can't have the same experience twice. A human being can't have the same experience twice. I don't know if you're familiar with the double slit experiment in quantum mechanics, which is, I don't know if I should start going into this, but it's this crazy conundrum in quantum mechanics where, I mean, it's long, but basically the gist of it is, and sorry for like simplifying it so much, is that if you fire photons, so particles of light, through a slit, it goes through, and then there's like a line of light on the other side, or a cluster of light on the other side. If you do it through two slits, there is not two lines of light. There's like stripes of light like this, one in the center between where the two slits are, and then gradually disappearing other lines. And this is, they figured out because of, it's an interference pattern, because because photons act like waves, basically, and but they're also particles, so they're both particles and waves simultaneously, which they haven't really worked out. And so they cancel each other out. Sorry, this is my and you get this interference pattern. But the funny thing is that if you decide that, you know what, we're going to watch which slit the photon goes through. When you do this, and you do it hundreds of thousands of times, and you watch, and you go, okay, that one went through that one went through that one went through. At the end, you don't have the interference pattern, you just have two lines. So it's like the particles know you're watching, which is pretty crazy, right? So this is like but they just go, okay, that's what it does, so let's work out everything around that. And it works. But they don't know why it does that, why particles behave like this, why they have this wave-particle duality. Then there's all kinds of other things with entanglement, and anyway, it goes on and on, which I don't really understand. I don't get it. I'm not a scientist. But it's an issue, and it highlights this very problem about consciousness and being conscious beings that we experience. We're always here and now. We're not in the past or in the future. And science predicts that actually all of that happens at the same time. Space-time is this one fabric where everything happens simultaneously, and we are everywhere, always. And we're dead right now as well. We're all dead, and as well as about to be born. So there's like a complexity there which can't be ignored. But going back to DMT, for instance, there's a molecule that there's a direct relationship between consciousness and matter, because there's something which is physical that we can isolate that completely changes your consciousness, completely changes your perception of who you are, where you are. Well, not who you are, but where you are and why you are. And that's a powerful thing, and consciousness is just ignored in science. Scientists just kind of block it out. They block out anything that might have anything to do with mystical experience, religion, consciousness, and I think that's beginning to change. So the answer is I kind of sit in the middle, and that's the interesting place. What is that? What is that middle ground? And the other thing, one more thing, sorry, this idea that mathematics is the thing that sort of justifies consciousness. Science. All scientific thought is kind of proved through maths. But there's this kind of there's these givens that you just kind of go, okay, well that's a given. Like the Big Bang, there was nothing before the Big Bang, and then there was Big Bang. So it's like, all right, you just have to assume that. Then everything works. Then general relativity and everything, quantum mechanics works, and that the universe ends somehow. And that also sort of talks about this idea of zero, the number zero, and maths integrates the number zero always. But in the universe, in the observed universe, there's no evidence of zero. There's no evidence of nothing. There's no evidence of nothingness. Perhaps before the Big Bang there was nothing, but they can't prove that. It's a complete hypothesis. Perhaps after the end of the universe, there's nothing, but it's all hypothetical. So where does zero come from? What is zero? To me, zero is an infinite line. That's infinite. I can see infinite everywhere. But zero doesn't, for me, exist. Don't quote me on that. You might do, but like.
Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you.